Okay, are we back? Can y'all hear me? Sorry about that. So then I started the stream again, and then I was in the wrong live. I went to the Cuba live instead of the Zimbabwe live. So now we gotta wait for y'all to come back. Are you back? Okay. Hello. Thank you. Welcome back. Sorry for the technical difficulties. Apologies. We're just gonna say it's the police, but it's also that we just gotta level up our production skills. Oh, the Facebook's not working. So let's see if I can get all the streams back up, and then we'll let the people come back in, and then we'll get in again. We'll get into it again. Damn, Facebook. Let's go. What? Okay. I see 6 of y'all on YouTube. Welcome back. Welcome back. Sorry for the technical difficulties. This is our first stream in a while. We're gonna tighten up. We learn through experience. We learn by making mistakes. We learn when things break. So yeah, Musa just let me know what was the last thing y'all heard. Last thing y'all heard was talking about Herzl reaching out to Rhodes, being like, put me on game. Let's share strategies for how to commit genocide against innocent people. Then we talked about the different private companies contracted by imperialist nations to build settler colonial projects all over the world. Happened in Southeast Asia, happened in Africa, happened in the Americas, happened in occupied Palestine. It is a tactic, and now we're going to get into the steps. Step by step, what are the phases of settler colonialism? And again, if you take nothing away from this presentation, take away the fact that settler colonialism is a project of capitalist expansion. It is how imperialist nations expanded their land bases in order to make imperialism and capitalism the dominant economic system on the planet. We would not be living in these conditions right now, like living through the people getting kidnapped off the street by unmarked pigs. We wouldn't be living through like catastrophic climate change, the rising sea level, the unlivable temperatures. We'd not be living through a live stream genocide that we are watching on Instagram, on social media, if not for this process initiated by capitalist expansion using settler colonialism. Like, it is really one of the fundamental pieces of how imperialism became the global system that we are surviving to this day. So if you take away nothing else, take away that. But what are the phases of settler colonialism? Let's break down how it worked in Zimbabwe and how it worked in these other places. So the imperialist nation, in this particular time in history, the monarchy, would contract with a private company with shareholders in order to go into a territory that the imperialist nation had its eyes on and engage in a series of trickery and fuck shit. One of the first things that that company will do was look for the local rulers of the nations occupying the territory it wants to steal. And that company, just like they did with Lobungula, will enter into treaties with those local rulers. They have no intention whatsoever of honoring the treaties. Like, we already know that. They're not intending in any way, shape, or form to hold to what they're agreeing to in these documents that are already written in their favor. They just want something on paper, some thin legal pretext to use to carry out the rest of the project. Oftentimes, rulers would enter into these treaties and they'd be written in English and they would have no translators. And the rulers would be like, what is this saying? And the Europeans just like, oh, it's just saying that we can have this portion of the mine. But really, the contract was saying, like, we get all this shit. They didn't care. They just wanted like some paper thin legal pretext to carry out the next steps. Then they would use that paper thin legal pretext, the treaty that they had no intention whatsoever of honoring at any point, and they would use that treaty to steal land for its employees. The employees of the company, the British South African Company, the Anglo-Palestine Company, the Plymouth Company, those employees are the settlers. Those are the Oregon Trail people. Those are the people in the covered wagons. Those are the pioneers. Those are the people that are working for this company in order to expand for the imperialist nation. The settlers obviously are going to be facing continuous indigenous resistance from the people that actually own the land. And so the company forms a paramilitary force. It arms and trains the settlers to engage in armed defense of the settler colonial project. They want to make sure that they can kill indigenous people, kill African people while they're engaged in the process of stealing land so they can do that shit undisturbed. That paramilitary force in each of these settler states then goes on to become the police. Once the company hands over control of the settler colony is established to the imperialist nation, and the imperialist nation establishes like its like settler state structure with its apartheid system and its laws, then they deputize this paramilitary force into the official security forces, aka police, of the settler colony. Then, of course, the settlers establish a system of laws to dispossess the indigenous people of their land. They say that you're not allowed to own your own land. If you have like a little piece of land, you have to pay taxes on it to us, even though you probably have had it for hundreds of years in your family. They say, okay, if you want to have a little piece of land, you have to pay taxes, and it can only be like this shitty land over here, and we're gonna have the part where that can actually grow food or that has like the water supply. They basically established a legal framework to allow them to have dominance over the territory and dominance over the indigenous population. They criminalize the existence of the indigenous population in every way they can. They do everything that they can to control the movement of the indigenous populations. They're basically legalizing and bureaucratizing the process of genocide. Like that's what this is. Like that's what an apartheid state is. That's what Jim Crow was, as a matter of fact, and that's what Israel is doing in occupied Palestine. It's literally just the legalized version of the wanton death and destruction and murder that was carried out initially to establish the settler state. Instead, they just make it happen through like courts and police and prisons, but it's essentially still doing the same motherfucking thing. I probably should not swear because this is not on the APRP page. So let me reel it in. But when I get angry, I just start swearing. Fourth step is after they have, established their paramilitary force, made that force into their police and their armies in a lot of cases, privatized control of the land with their apartheid laws and their apartheid system. Then they start moving the indigenous people around into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces of territory so they could be more easily controlled, both in terms of their day-to-day movements, but also in terms of like their educational system, their access to resources, and their access to employment. And so essentially what they do is they establish concentration camps, like little areas with very little resources that are like walled tightly and patrolled by the settler police forces, by the settler militias. And they basically warehouse all the African people in there, all the people whose land they're stealing in there, and say that you can only come out of here, come out of this concentration camp you put you in, put out of you this reservation that we put you in, if we say that you can come out. So in Azania, for example, they had the pass laws. In occupied Palestine, they have the checkpoint system. In the US, of course, they have the reservation system. In Southern Africa, they have the Bantu stands. In Rhodesia, they have the Bantu stands. It's all the same thing. It's concentration camps. It's just basically a way to control the movements of the people whose land they're stealing from. So they're all in one place. So they're all oppressed. So they don't have access to basic necessities like food, water, education, jobs, housing. And so you can keep them as weak and divided as possible so that when they try to fight back, you can repress them effectively. That's the whole point. Fifth thing they do is just establish a more robust legal system and that system of past policies that control movement to basically say that this is how things are supposed to be, this is how things will always be. And then you use those police, which again started off as your paramilitary force, your armed settlers that work for the company that were just defending their pioneer column. They become your police and they also become the enforcers of your legal system. And this is again just a way to legalize, to bureaucratize the system of land theft and genocide that is required to establish a settler state. In the early stages, the settlers were taking up guns themselves, killing African and indigenous people themselves, stealing their own land. In the later stages, when the settler colony is well established and has its own legal system, has its own leadership system, then they have this more, so what's the word I'm looking for? More legit face for genocide. Then you just say, oh, it's illegal. Oh, the police are just following the laws. Oh, they're just protecting people's property. Like they just established a legal system to concretize their theft and their genocide. And then once all this has been established by that private company, they sell the land to the mother country, they get a payoff, they move on to the next territory like locusts. And then let me see, I'm getting some feedback, so let me see What's being said? Devin, link me on your next break. I'll chill in the background. You can ask me questions. Okay, cool. Thank you. And then what are y'all saying in the chat? Settlers equals squatters. Correct. It says these people and their descendants who carry on the dynamic. That is also correct. Like one thing that happens in a settler colony that then becomes a settler state, which is the case of the US, which is also the case of the Zionist entity, is again like the early settlers, the employees of these private companies that are established in the settler colony, like they are the ones with the guns. They are the ones killing the African people, killing the Indians. They are the ones taking people's scalps, killing babies, destroying the water supply. Like they have to do that shit with their bare hands in order to be employees of this company, in order to establish that colony, in order to get their land. Then they, the company and the imperialist nation established the legal framework, established the state system that legalizes what was being done by the settlers themselves, and now there's like a layer of separation. Before it was the settlers killing African people, now it's their police and their legal system and their prison system that's carrying out essentially the same thing of controlling and killing African people. They are a level removed from it. However, think about the kind of culture that is produced in a nation that has this as its origin. We are currently living within it when we are in the United States, and we are also seeing the same thing in the Zionist entity, like the unhinged culture that is produced by settler colonialism, where people are like, I have a God-given right to this land that my ancestors killed millions of people in order for me to occupy. Like that is okay. That was like an established part of history. We won. This is our land now. There are even settlers, like there's like this whole concept of like pretendians, where the descendants of European settlers in the United States will say like, I have a Cherokee grandmother, or I'm like 1/4 Navajo, or one Blackfoot, or what have you, where the reality situation is that their ancestors were actively engaged in the process of genocide to take this land. And then down the line, they created a family mythology that said, actually, we were always here. Actually, the people we killed, they don't exist. We've always been here. We're the real indigenous people. And that is also precisely what Israeli people do as well in occupied Palestine. They say 2,000 years ago or what have you, my people were here first, and the Palestinians are the settlers. We're the real indigenous people. They also say the same thing in Azania in Zimbabwe. The European settlers say this was empty land. The Africans were settlers too. We just came and we were better at it than them. But really, this is no one's land. Like they create like this national mythology, this identity that's deeply rooted in the process, the structure of settler colonialism, and they spread it throughout the society, and then everybody else acts like it's normal when it's really like extremely twisted, extremely wild. So yeah, I appreciate that. Like the it's really important to understand like the culture that we're living in today and how it has its roots in this process. You cannot understand anything about how to make a revolution in a context of a settler state like the United States without understanding settler colonialism. You cannot understand it. It's literally the foundation of everything. But let's move to and then the picture on the slide is some of these settler police forces of the British South African Company arresting an indigenous person on their own land. So there's an artist depiction of some of this process. And just to drive home the point about how the paramilitary force of armed and trained settlers employed by the private company, the British South African Company, then move on to become the security and police forces, oftentimes the military forces of the settler states, once control is handed over back to the imperialist nation that contracted the company in the first place. I just wanted to show y'all an artist depiction, a picture of a British South Africa police officer and his dog, just to drive home how related these processes are all over the world. Just like the British South African Company Police, their private paramilitary force contracted by the British South African Company, became the police of the settler colony, and then the state of Rhodesia, the Rhodesian Defense Forces. The same exact thing happened in the United States, happened in occupied Palestine, happened in settler colonies all over the world. So, next slide. There's never been a point in history where, when people came to engage in looting and destruction and murder and devastation, that any colonized population just rolled over and took it. Understand, in every single part of the world where these imperialist nations were attempting to expand their territory and expand their power through settler colonialism, through imperialist conquest, there was resistance, and Zimbabwe was no exception. The African people in Zimbabwe fought back at every single step of the way. In 1965, there was anti-colonial revolutions popping up all over the world, all over Africa. The British government saw the writing on the wall. They started making noise about granting paper independence to Zimbabwe, because after they saw revolutionary national liberation struggles successfully overthrow colonial governments all over Africa and all over the global South, Britain was like, okay, let's just cut this off at the pass. Let's give them their independence, and then try to negotiate the independence in such a way that we still maintain control, even if they have symbolic independence. So that was what Britain was trying to do. However, the settlers in Rhodesia had a different idea. They had established their own reactionary identity. They were like, we killed all these people. We stole all this land. How are you going to say that they're independent now? Absolutely not. And so the British, or the settler government in Rhodesia, declares independence from Britain in 1965 in response to those moves from Britain to attempt to grant paper independence. The settlers in Rhodesia are like, absolutely not. We are going to form our own independent settler state. Does that sound familiar to you? Where else did that happen in the world? Where else did that happen in the world? Let me take a break from talking and y'all tell me, where is another situation where an imperialist nation established a settler colony, and then those settlers attempted or won their independence on stolen land from the imperialist nation? Is there another place y'all know where that happened? Let's see. Segun says, sound familiar? What does it sound like? What does it sound like? And then someone pointing out, are really a dedication to the dogs, so they cared more about dogs than colonizing for a while. Correct. That is an enduring culture, I guess, or an enduring aspect of Western imperialist culture, to do horrifying things to humans, colonized humans, and then be like, our dogs, our pets. And I love dogs. I feel like dogs deserve much better than to be shock troops for settler paramilitary forces, but it is, in fact, an aspect of their culture to be all like animal activists while devastating humans. But as y'all are pointing out, another place where a settler colony fought for independence from an imperialist nation to build an independent nation on someone else's land is, of course, the United States, the good old US of A. That is exactly what happened during the counter-revolution of 1776. During the counter-revolution of 1776, the European squatters in the 13 original colonies were like, why should we have to pay taxes to y'all for our raw materials, or to import finished goods, when we are the ones that killed all the Indians? We are the ones that are enslaving these Africans. We are the ones that took the land. What you mean? We shouldn't have to pay you. We want to be our own country. Like, that is what that was. And the indigenous people were like, what? This is our land. They were fighting for their continued existence. The African people are like, I don't want to be in this raggedy ass nation. We don't want to be an independent settler state. Y'all are enslaving us. And so while the counter-revolution of 1776 was happening, where the European settlers were fighting with the British monarchy for control of the land that they stole and committed genocide for, African indigenous people were engaging in all kinds of acts of resistance to attempt to define our own independent path, separate from the attempted establishment of that settler state. So I just wanted to point that out, that this is it's like a trend. And the same thing actually happened in Azania. Someone else pointing out that it happened in Australia. I don't know a lot about the history of Australia, but I would love to learn more, because I just really like identifying these patterns all over the world. And then same thing the English settlers did when they won their independence from England. In Algeria, the OAS settler terrorists they tried to declare an independent state from France. Very interesting. So these patterns repeat all over the world. And this is why it's very important to not exceptionalize any anti-colonial struggle, any struggle against imperialism. We have to understand it's literally the same enemy that we are fighting on many, many different fronts. in order for us to be victorious, we have to understand the connections between our struggles. We have to understand the strategies that these imperialist nations have been sharing across the world in order to repress us. Because Zimbabwe took their land back. The model that was followed to establish settler-colonialism in Zimbabwe was overthrown by the armed revolutionary resistance of African people in Zimbabwe. And if they were able to overturn this strategy, and this strategy was used elsewhere, that means other people can do it too. This is the point of learning about this. So, in 1965, reactionary settlers in Zimbabwe attempted to declare independence from Britain. Prime Minister Ian Smith straight up says that he was inspired by the counter-revolution of 1776 that happened in the United States. He straight up says that. He's like, we're trying to get on the American Revolution time. So Britain is like, that's not going to work. We want to maintain control of this resource-rich territory. And so they appeal to the United Nations, and the United Nations applies sanctions on Rhodesia in 1966 and 1968. And one very important thing to understand about economic sanctions is that they are always, always, always felt the worst by the most marginalized portions of the population. And so Rhodesia was a European settler state with a reactionary settler minority in power. Those European settlers did not feel the sanctions. They were like, oh, we can't buy goods from this. We'll just pay a little bit more and get it from there. But the Africans living in Rhodesia under reactionary settler rule felt the sanctions intensely. There were vast shortages of food, vast shortages of medication, intense inflation, mass suffering for the African people in Rhodesia, while the settlers just carried on about their business. And that was, again, Britain requesting sanctions on Rhodesia to attempt to get the settlers to stop trying to declare an independent state. So the combination of the already violent and repressive reactionary settler rule, and then the deterioration in conditions for the African people created by the sanctions, basically led to a situation where the Africans were like, absolutely not. We're already suffering with you stealing our land, and now we're being sanctioned because of you, and you're trying to build an independent state on our land. This is not going to happen. We're not doing this with y'all. And so it kicks off mass indigenous resistance to reactionary settler rule, the 15-year armed national liberation struggle led by ZANU, the Zimbabwe African National Union, which is, of course, founded by Robert Mugabe. That's also when ZAPU, a separate organization that would become part of ZANU-PF, ZANU starts, they would become together, become ZANU-PF, also is founded. And these organizations quickly build international anti-imperialist connections. In the armed national liberation struggle in Zimbabwe, the revolutionary forces received support from Mozambique, from Tanzania, from Ghana, from Guinea, from Cuba, and from the USSR and the People's Republic of China. They were connected to the global socialist revolution and to other revolutionary national liberation struggles across the African continent. They quickly show the settlers what time it is. The Africans are fierce fighters. They are organized. The African population is united and wanting to overthrow the reactionary settler rule. And Ian Smith is like, oh no, like they were not ready. And so initially, Ian Smith proposes a compromise. He proposes a two-state solution. No, I am not kidding. He proposes Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, where the settlers would have their territory, the indigenous Africans would have their territory, and they would coexist side by side. Let me tell you, a two-state solution is a bad idea wherever it is proposed. The idea that people who acquired a land base through genocide and theft and vast intentional destruction of an indigenous society should be granted a little piece of land for their trouble is absurd, no matter where it is put forward, whether it's in occupied Palestine or whether it is in Zimbabwe. And so he puts forward the two-state solution. The Zimbabwe National Liberation Movement is like, absolutely not. Get out of our face. They keep fighting, and the armed resistance in Zimbabwe forces the reactionary settler government into a ceasefire and then peace talks. The peace talks result in the Lancaster Agreement, which we're going to talk about in a second. It's a half measure is what we'll say. And then elections are held in liberated Zimbabwe, and then Mugabe and ZANU-PF, which is again the combined forces of ZANU and ZAPU, win those elections in a landslide, and ZANU-PF and Robert Mugabe become the first president and the first independent ruling party of a now liberated Zimbabwe, a Zimbabwe that engaged in an armed struggle of national liberation against settler-colonialism, backed by Western imperialism, and defeated it. Let's see. What are y'all saying? I'm tired of talking, so I'm going to take a break. Did this happen in Puerto Rico? So Puerto Rico is a straight up colony of the United States that has a lot of these structures in place, but I don't think Puerto Rico is a settler colony. Let's see. These settlers got some nerve, correct? Had Big Teal. I see like some familiar faces. I used to do YouTube streams on the APRP New Mexico channel. And some of y'all are recognized from the APRP New Mexico channel. Look at that. Look at that. Thanks for tuning in. Let's see. Okay. Let's keep it moving. So I have this clip that I want to play from a news documentary called Goodbye Rhodesia that was produced in 1979 that shows some of the response of African people in Zimbabwe to the victory of the armed phase of the national liberation struggle. So I'm going to play it. I'm going to attempt to play it. And if the audio does not work, please let me know and I'll fix it. And then we're going to talk about the Lancaster House Agreement and all of its limitations in just a moment. But I just want to show y'all how Africans in Zimbabwe were talking about the victory of the national liberation struggle.
The end of 78. Inside an African compound, angry drums beat out a New Year message. Bitter words.
Our children are dying of hunger. Food is what we need. Conditions are getting worse. We may as well be dead. We hope our children will have a better future.
A future still remote. For blacks, 78 was a year of broken promises, frustrated hopes. 79 looks little better. Do you think that you will have to continue to fight for your Zimbabwe?
I shall continue to fight. Even my comrades, I can see as I meet them, they are very serious about the problem. They won't stop till we get our Zimbabwe. We won't drop down till we get what we want, because we had much blood on which is already wasted, of which we won't get back.
I was born here. I intend to die here. We've had our mortar attacks. We've got through them. We live day after day with this. And there's no way or place for me to go. This is my home. And this is where I intend to die.
Scotland versus the rest, New Year's Day, the annual bowls match on the greens above Umtali. The players know that the game is
Okay, back. I had to stop it because I cannot. You see how the African was like, we are going to fight, and we will not give up. This is our land. We suffer so much. Like, it's too late now. Like, we have to be victorious. And the woman was like, this is my home. I was like, could you even be in the sun for more than like a good 15 minutes without serious complications? Like, what do you mean? And then it cuts to the cricket match. Like, good Lord. This is what they built. This is what they committed genocide for. This is what they put people in concentration camps for. This is what they established this apartheid state for, so they could play cricket on someone else's land while the indigenous people are starving. Wow. Okay. So we'll move to the next slide. So let's talk about the Lancaster Agreement. So the armed phase of the national liberation struggle in Zimbabwe, carried out by the forces of ZANU and ZAPU, who had made those international connections and anti-imperialist and socialist movement connections, forced the reactionary Ian Smith government into a ceasefire, into peace talks. Unfortunately, the raggedy British government managed to weasel its way into those peace talks to attempt to negotiate an outcome that would be amenable for continued British influence in Zimbabwe. And so the outcome of those peace talks was what's known as the Lancaster House Agreement. The delegates from each of the forces represented, which is again the reactionary settler government, the British government, and the National Liberation Forces, reached the Lancaster House Agreement in December 1979, and the reaching of that agreement leads to the official end of the armed struggle in Zimbabwe. Some of the terms of the Lancaster House Agreement included that Zimbabwe could take its land back, but they got to wait 10 years to take back the land, to take back their own land, because it would have been too disruptive to the settlers who were squatting on it. The other term in the Lancaster House Agreement was that Zimbabwe could only take land from settlers who were willing to give it up, who would freely give it up. And those settlers would sell the land they stole back to the indigenous people. It's called the willing buyer, willing seller term. And then the settlers are selling their land back, and the British government would pay the settlers for the land. So Zimbabwe has to wait 10 years. Zimbabwe can only take the land back from settlers who are willing to give it up. And then those settlers will be paid by the British government to take the land. So how do folks think that went? How do y'all think those terms worked out for the Africans in Zimbabwe? Let me have a stop talking break so y'all can think on it. Like, think about those terms. They said Zimbabwe wait 10 years. They said only take back the land from the settlers willing to give it up. And you just saw the lady who was like, I was born here. I'm going to die here. It's my home. And then Britain was going to pay the settlers for the land. Yeah. So spoiler is that it did not work out at all. So the willing buyer, willing seller provision of the Lancaster House Agreement essentially led to a process in which the process of taking the land back was incredibly slow because the settlers were not willing to give up their land. Only a handful were willing to give it up. Then, and throughout this whole period, Robert Mugabe is in power. He is leading Zimbabwe. He is popular. ZANU-PF continues to be in the ruling power. They continue to enjoy elections. They continue to enjoy broad support among the African population in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe's attempts to continue its development. They're building international connections, but the process of taking back the land, because of this willing buyer, willing seller provision, is incredibly, incredibly slow. Then in 1997, the Blair government comes to power in Britain, and the Blair government says, none of us were even around when Britain stole your land, so it's not our fault, so we're not going to pay. And they make this declaration in a letter that is delivered by an Irish lady. I wonder if I can find it in my notes, because I remember reading that, and I was like, girl, they stole land, your land too, and then you just let them. Hold on, let me see if I can find it. Let's see. No, it's not in my notes. I didn't write that her name. But yeah, basically they wrote up this letter where they were basically like, we were not the ones that did it. It was the other British government, the old one. We're new and we had nothing to do with it. So we're not going to pay. If y'all want to find a willing buyer, you, the Zimbabwe government, are going to have to pay them for their land. And the way to deliver this message was with some Irish lady. I wish I had written down the name, but that shit blew my mind because Ireland was one of the first settler colonial conquests of the British Empire. So like have a British lady or Irish lady in the British government going to another indigenous people and saying like, that's the land that got stolen is your business, you pay for it. It's actually really wild, but that's what settler colonial governments be doing. They got, Central American and Mexican people working in ICE. Like that's what they do. They got African police officers. They are constantly enlisting colonized people in the project of maintaining the settler colonial and imperialist project. So it's not really surprising, but it's disgusting every time. Anyway, so the Blair government reneges on that portion of the Lancaster Agreement. They say willing buyer, willing seller, but Zimbabwe, you pay for your own land back. And then Zimbabwe, the African people in Zimbabwe, the masses of African people say, we are absolutely not going to do that. We are not going to pay squatters for land that they stole. That's not a thing that's going to happen. And so then in the year 2000, 3 years later, what's known as fast track land reform starts. And what fast track land reform was the veterans of the armed phase of the national liberation struggle, the Second Chimurenga, rolling up on their ancestral lands, like their grandma's old farm, with guns and being like, we are taking it back by force. That is literally, when we hear fast track land reform in Zimbabwe, picture what's on the slide. Veterans of the national liberation struggle going up to their ancestral lands and kicking the settlers off with guns. I love this. I love this so much. You got to do what you got to do. So the masses of African people in Zimbabwe, in fact, started off fast-track land reform. And then the Zimbabwe government, controlled by ZANU-PF, responds by passing a constitutional amendment which basically nationalizes the process of fast-track land reform and makes it legally viable, and also deprives settlers of the right to challenge it in Zimbabwe's courts. So the organized masses of Africans in Zimbabwe took back their own land by force, and then the Revolutionary National Liberation Party, the ZANU-PF, legalized the process of taking their land back. You love to see it. You love to see it. Don't pay nobody for nothing. Take back your shit. Hopefully that got you hype. Hopefully you're starting to get the wheels turning about what we need to do. And we'll move to the next slide. So something, ever since the fast track land reform and the constitutional amendment was passed, the imperialist countries, they never just like roll over and take it, right? Like, we can engage in armed resistance and force them out, and they'll try to weasel their way into the peace talks to make sure they get a peace. We can overturn colonial rule and build independence, and they'll find a way to make sure that we are so submissive to them. Whenever we have a victory in an anti-colonial struggle, the imperialist system and the imperialist nations always find a way to get their get back, always. And so Zimbabwe took its land back. They initiated the fast track land reform in the masses and then legalized it with the constitutional amendment. And then the UK and the United Nations and the United States responded with economic sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe with the intent of destroying Zimbabwe's economy. And now the consequence of those economic sanctions on Zimbabwe was drastic inflation, massive devaluing of Zimbabwe's currency, drastic shortages of resources, basically the devastation of its economy intentionally carried out by these imperialist nations who were basically retaliating for the Africans taking back their own land. And the narrative about Zimbabwe is that it's not the sanctions that destroyed Zimbabwe's economy. No. It's the fact that they took back their land and these Africans don't know what to do with it. That is what people say with a straight face. They will say Mugabe was a dictator. They'll say ZANU-PF shouldn't be in power anymore. They'll say these Africans do not know how to manage their own country. And they will say that the Africans do not know how to care for their own ancestral land. And that is the reason why Zimbabwe's economy is suffering. Like, these are mainstream narratives propagated in capitalist media, which are so wildly absurd and racist on their face. Like, these are people who have been tied to that land for generations, for literally hundreds of years, thousands of years. And you are saying that in just like the 100 or so year period where y'all were squatting on their land, that they forgot all of those skills, and now that they have it back, they have no idea what to do, and they need the European settlers that committed genocide in order to know how to work their own goddamn land. Like, people say that with a straight face, and it's so racist. It's so racist. But the reality of land reform in Zimbabwe, of the process of the Africans in Zimbabwe taking back their land, is in fact that hundreds of thousands of poor and working class African people in Zimbabwe were given access to their land and were able to establish substantial agricultural production to meet their own needs, to feed their families, and also to be able to sell at local markets to produce a living. They were able to grow food in order to sustain the nation on this land just by getting access to it. There's also significant investment in building the infrastructure of Zimbabwe. The new land has been developed. They have built wells, they have built homes, they have built schools, they have built roads, they have built dams. They have made significant use of this land to meet the needs of the African population in Zimbabwe. And they have done that while being devastated by economic sanctions imposed by colonial powers who are again punishing the Africans in Zimbabwe for taking back their own land. And these European powers, the United Nations, the United States, the European Union, that sanctioned Zimbabwe at the behest of Britain, have propagated the narrative that Zimbabwe's currency was devalued, that its inflation increased, that its economy was collapsed because the Africans do not know how to govern themselves. But listen to me, it is not true. All the Africans that got their land back were able to help develop their nation collectively. It is a lie. It is a lie that the land reform destroyed Zimbabwe's economy. It was, in fact, the sanctions. So some of the things that ZANU-PF has done while in power in Zimbabwe is to, instead of having Zimbabwe's economy focused around extraction, as it was when it was a settler state, a British settler colony, instead the focus of Zimbabwe's economy has been health and education. ZANU-PF established a tuition-free education programs all over the country. They established free healthcare programs, including in the countryside, in rural areas with very little medical infrastructure before ZANU-PF came to power. And those medical centers are distributing vaccines, they're distributing reproductive health care, they're giving people guidance around nutrition, and all together, all of these medical programs and educational programs decrease the mortality rate of women, babies, and kids all across Zimbabwe, and it also has led to one of the highest literacy rates in Africa of 97%. And so you see, when Zimbabwe was under reactionary settler colonial rule, reactionary British settler colonial rule, the focus was on extraction, the focus was on control. The Africans were warehoused into concentration camps, into Bantustans, and denied access to their basic needs. And then when the Africans fought for their liberation, engaged in that national liberation struggle, and forced the colonizers off of their territory, were able to establish independent government, were able to establish or were able to take their land back, the first thing they did was prioritize the well-being of its citizens, because ZANU-PF is a socialist political party, and socialism is focused on life, not on profit. This is the difference. So when people say that these settler societies established by Western imperialism or were victorious because they were more advanced ideologically or politically or in terms of the development of their society, understand that it's not true. These were societies built around destruction, around genocide, around extraction, around theft. What Zimbabwe is in the hands of African people is a society centered around life. This is what they were fighting for when they were fighting to take their land back. And of course, the primary accomplishment of the ZANU-PF government and also Robert Mugabe, we will not accept Mugabe slander here, is that they took their land back. They militarily and politically defeated Settler-Colonialism. They took back their land and they established a better society, period. So Zimbabwe still suffering under economic sanctions imposed by the Western world, primarily by the United States, the United Nations, and the European Union. Bush administration imposed additional sanctions on Zimbabwe in 2001, known as the Zadera Act. The European Union also followed suit by establishing sanctions, because wherever the US goes, the European Union follows. The European Union did remove those sanctions in 2014, but the US continues to impose sanctions on Zimbabwe to this day. And the presidential administration, like each presidential administration of the US, has to recertify, re-up those sanctions on Zimbabwe. And each administration, including the Biden administration, has continued to extend those sanctions on Zimbabwe. I'm sure Trump will too, but y'all keep telling me The Democrats are better for the world, better for oppressed and marginalized people, but the Democrats are the ones drone bombing, sanctioning, engaging in color revolutions, and as much destruction as the Republicans too. So y'all can suck a dick. As a matter of fact, one of the times when the ZANU Act in 2001 that was passed by the Bush administration imposing sanctions on Zimbabwe, Bernie Sanders, feel the burn, Bernie Sanders voted to oppose those sanctions. So, yeah, the blind spot of the U.S. left or progressive forces in settler states when it comes to complicity. But Settler-Colonialism globally is a consistent factor. Anywho, so some of the impacts of economic sanctions on Zimbabwe mean, and this is the case for nations all over the world. In fact, 1/3 of the Earth's population is suffering under economic sanctions from the Western world. 1/3 of humans on this planet living under economic sanctions. So what I'm about to describe for Zimbabwe, understand it applies to a significant portion of the Earth's population. So Zimbabwe cannot get access to credit or cash, which means it cannot get loans to buy resources or meet the material needs of its citizens. It also means that it cannot pay its debts. If it were to get loans, it cannot get the cash it needs to pay for those loans, tanking Zimbabwe's global credit rating. Additionally, because there are drastic shortages of raw materials, of manufactured goods, of basic necessities needed to maintain the needs of the population and to maintain Zimbabwe's infrastructure, industries across Zimbabwe's economy suffer. Less things are manufactured in Zimbabwe for export, and Zimbabwe is forced to rely on exporting raw materials like most global south countries, more African countries. Industry suffering also means less jobs for the Africans living in Zimbabwe, which means high rates of unemployment, drastically falling national revenues, and skyrocketing inflation, which leads to the drastic devaluing of Zimbabwe currency. This also means on the ground, day to day, that the regular, poor and working class African people in Zimbabwe cannot access basic necessities such as food, such as medication, such as secure housing. They also, because their currency has been devalued, can't even pull money out of the banks in Zimbabwe. So understand, when you hear economic sanctions applied on a country, it is the people living in that country, poor and working class people, that feel those sanctions most acutely, and Zimbabwe is no exception. And so all told, in the entire regime of economic sanctions applied on Zimbabwe, again, to punish them for taking their land back, Zimbabwe has lost over $42 billion over the course of 18 years because of sanctions. And so again, anytime you hear someone say that Zimbabwe's economy is suffering because the African people took their land back, lies, nonsense, propaganda. It is the sanctions, it is the intentional impact of the economic sanctions applied on Zimbabwe to punish them, period. So we are still, as I said, in that third Chimurenga, the third and present phase of the ongoing centuries-long national liberation struggle of Zimbabwe. That first Chimurenga was resistance to the first European colonizers. That second Chimurenga was the armed phase of the national liberation struggle. The third Chimurenga is happening right now. It is the process of continuing to take back the land. It is also the process of surviving the economic devastation of these sanctions imposed by Western powers. The other thing that Zimbabwe is resisting is continuous attempts to engage in regime change on the part of these Western imperialist countries. That is why you have probably heard that Robert Mugabe is a dictator. That is why, because this is what they do. They say Castro is a dictator. They say Nkrumah is a dictator. They say Maduro and Chavez are dictators. They say Ortega is a dictator. And the uniting theme is that these are revolutionaries that led national liberation movements that overthrew imperialist powers. And the imperialist powers respond by demonizing the national liberation movements, the national liberation parties, and these revolutionary leaders. And then the rest of the very confused forces of the Western left are like, okay, and they start repeating Mugabe's a dictator. And then the U.S. uses its propaganda efforts, its destabilization efforts through forces like the National Endowment for Democracy and U.S. aid. Rest in hell, U.S. aid. I'm glad you're dead. But U.S. aid used to be wheeling and dealing in Zimbabwe to foment forces opposed to ZANU-PF and Mugabe. And in 2017, those forces, backed by Western imperialism, successfully pushed out Robert Mugabe in a coup. However, a year later, during the 2018 national elections held in Zimbabwe, the masses of African people in Zimbabwe still overwhelmingly backed ZANU-PF. So they got Robert Mugabe out of there, but they could not get ZANU-PF out of there because ZANU-PF took back the land. And the land is the primary, the occupation and the settler-colonialism in Zimbabwe was the primary contradiction. And so the African people were going to go with who was taking back our land. And that was ZANU-PF. No matter what they do, no matter what lies they spread about Mugabe, no matter what lies they spread about fast-track land reform, the African people in Zimbabwe know they must have their land back. And that is why they put ZANU-PF back in power, even after all of those shenanigans and trickery carried out by U.S. imperialism. So ZANU-PF is in the Third Chimurenga, still leading the recovery of Zimbabwe's economy, which is the foundation of that economic recovery under the sanctions imposed by U.S., UN, EU, is the land reform. This is how Zimbabwe has been able to survive despite the economic onslaught carried out by these sanctions imposed by Western imperialist countries. Because the Africans took their land back, they can develop their country. They can feed themselves. They can build schools and hospitals and create jobs, even under sanctions. Zimbabwe, as of 2024, is now food self-sufficient. The African people in Zimbabwe, in control of their own land, are able to produce enough food for the nation to be food self-sufficient. The same Africans that imperialist powers claim do not know how to work their own land. Zimbabwe's economy, its growth, has also surpassed its neighbors in the past 3 years. In 2022, right after the COVID-19 pandemic, Zimbabwe's economy grew by 6.5%. South Africa, where 80% of the land is still controlled by Europeans and European corporations, only saw economic growth of 3.9% in the same period. And Zimbabwe's projected growth rate for 2024 was 3.5%. The South African average of all South African nations was 3.2%. So Zimbabwe, again, with its lands back in the hands of the indigenous people, is seeing a faster growing economy than the surrounding neocolonial nations. Zimbabwe is also fighting to build ties with the multipolar world. You can see in this picture ZANU-PF leader with Putin of Russia. African nations all across the continent have not fallen for the Russophobia that some of y'all have fallen for. They are not scared of Russia. They are trying to build economic ties with Russia, build ties as equals. They're doing the same thing with China. They are also doing the same thing with Cuba. They have also consistently shown up internationally for other national liberation struggles, resisting settler-colonialism. Zimbabwe has been a consistent supporter of the Palestinian struggle against Zionism, against imperialism. As a matter of fact, when myself, Musa, and Erica were at the Publications of the Left conference in February of last year, it was an international convening of representatives from revolutionary organs, like, publications, but also political parties from all over the world. So Zimbabwe was there, Vietnam was there, Russia, Greece, Ireland, Spain. There were some people from the United States. People from all over the world. And some of the people from the United States, I will not say the name of the organization because there's no need to, but they were straight up motherfucking Zionists in this international space. We were talking about, the conference was talking about putting out a position statement, basically declaring our solidarity with the Palestinian national liberation struggle and condemning Zionism. And these representatives from this organization in the U.S. also have branches in Europe. It's a socialist party. They get up and they say that October 7th was a pogrom against Jewish people, that Jewish people are only safe because Israel exists, and they do not support the resolution condemning Zionism and backing Palestine. And I feel like in my head, we like made eye contact, like the hood communists and ZANU-PF people. But either way, we were the loudest people in the room. We were like, free Palestine! No, death to Zionism, smash Zionism. Like the whole room started chanting. The Palestinian students of Elam were chanting. ZANU-PF was chanting. We were chanting. The Zionists was mad. It was amazing. It was amazing. Like the Africans in the room went hard as hell for Palestine. I will never forget that. In addition to showing solidarity for Palestine and the United Nations and Cuba, all over the world, Zimbabwe has also been one of the most consistent supporters of the national liberation struggle of the Sahrawi people in the Western Sahara. The Western Sahara is a settler colony established by Morocco and backed by Western imperialist nations. And the Sahrawi people are the indigenous people fighting for their land back. Zimbabwe opposes settler colonialism all over the world, y'all, all over the world. So consistently, every time Zimbabwe has a chance to give remarks at the United Nations or at any kind of global forum, they always mention Palestine and they always mention Western Sahara. Because Zimbabwe understands that you have to, in order to oppose settler colonialism in one place, you must oppose it everywhere. Because it's the same people all over this planet that are stealing the land for the same reason: capitalist and imperialist expansion. Zimbabwe is also seeking to join BRICS. So basically, Zimbabwe domestically is engaging in a process of national development driven by the land reform, driven by the African people getting their land back and resisting economic sanctions, surviving economic sanctions, thriving despite economic sanctions. And Zimbabwe is also internationally building ties with other nations struggling against settler colonialism, other nations resisting imperialism and economic sanctions. So we are in the Third Chimurenga. They were victorious in the Second Chimurenga. They are victorious in the Third Chimurenga. We should really hold up Zimbabwe, not just for taking their land back and showing us the way to do that, but also for how they have been able to use control of their land to survive economic warfare. This is a victory for the entirety of the African Revolution. We should all be proud of what the African people of Zimbabwe accomplished, and we should learn from this history, particularly those of us who are struggling in settler colonial states. Oopsie daisy. So we are coming to the close of my remarks, but actually, before I go into the positive actions, let me go back to the full screen of my face and look at some of your comments while I drink some water. I see a very long comment that looks like spam. Let's see. The Dem Party is the baby of this racist capitalist system. I have this huge jug and I'm just going to do it because I'm thirsty. Okay. So, someone quoted me saying, "Y'all can suck a dick." And can I say to you, I don't even remember when I said that. Like, I believe I said it, but man, when I get going, I just be coming out. Let's see what else. Sanctions are used by Western imperialist colonizers to coerce the indigenous people of that land to overthrow their own revolution and socialist government. That is precisely why they do it. It's basically a tactic of collective punishment. They are basically intending to create so much suffering among the civilian population that civilian population will rise up and overthrow their own revolution. It's precisely how the U.S. blockade on Cuba is intended to work. If you read the Mallory memo, like they straight up say it, the U.S. government official straight up says it. It's precisely how sanctions are intended to work in places like Iran, in places like the People's Democratic Republic of Korea, certainly in Zimbabwe. Like, whenever you hear economic sanctions, understand it is an intentional means of causing suffering among innocent people to destabilize countries in order to carry out or to win the policy priorities of the imperialist country. Like, that's why they do it. And then Big Teal saying, the sanctions are a way to isolate Zimbabwe economically and control the country 100%. Johnson saying, I hear many liberals spew the argument that these nations can't support themselves, but fail to mention the sanctions. Same with Cuba. Absolutely. Like, start paying attention to when you read about, like, economic crisis in Cuba, lines for gas, when you read about economic crisis in Zimbabwe, economic crisis in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, like, all of these countries are massively sanctioned by the US and other Western countries. But when you read media, like capitalist media coverage of the domestic problems, they never mention the sanctions. It's especially obvious with Cuba. You will never, ever, ever hear them mention the blockade except in like a throwaway line, if it's even there at all. They'll always talk about long lines for gas, shortages, what have you, to try to paint this picture of like basically a failing socialist state. And they don't mention the fact that the reason why these lines exist is because a shortage is created intentionally by the blockade. They do this on purpose. Let's see. I don't know what this one is. There's like a phone number or something. More power to you. No one call that number. Cuba is amazingly resilient. In spite of sanctions, Cuba sends its medical professionals to Africa and develop its own COVID-19 vaccine. They have like 3-4 COVID-19 vaccines, man. Oh my God. And they have like the public health system where every neighborhood had its own doctors. And the doctor lives in the neighborhood. And like during lockdown, they had them going door to door with the medical students, the Elon students, explain the situation to people, explaining how to like put on your mask and like take tests. Like, can you imagine like that level of like basic information collectivized? Like in the United States, we had the president telling people to like drink bleach and shit. Like it was just like really extremely politicized, and like just straight up conspiracy theories became mainstream, and like basic true information you had to get like from the New York Times, the Atlantic and shit. It was paywall. It was paywall. There was no public health effort to educate people about the basic shit about COVID, and everybody was like pointing a finger at each other about why it was so messed up. And I was like, it was a system that failed, y'all. It's not an individual failure. It's the people in power that intentionally did this to us. Cuba shows us another way is possible. Someone saying these are amazing developments by Zimbabwe despite the sanctions and decades of Western attacks. Correct. Zimbabwe is a victory. It is a victory. And then Musa, who was there in Cuba, talking about these crackers were literally Zionists in a room full of communists. It was the wildest shit I've ever seen. Like the level of audacity, like the boldness. I was like, why would you do that? You are drastically outnumbered. And let me tell you, I've been in multiple Cuba spaces where like the same people have done the same thing. I feel like we're in trouble, but I'm just like, God damn, like read the room. Like we oppose genocide. We are anti-imperialist. Like no one is going to get on board with Israel has a right to exist. Like we are beyond that. We are beyond that. Like what socialism are you on? God damn. Anyway, yes, we were locked in. American leftists are such garbage. I mean, you know, we have to struggle with them, man. We got to take it to a higher level. Let's see. Okay, so I am getting sleepy, so I'm going to go back to the slide. If you have any questions, actually, feel free to put them in the chat. I'm going to start moving to the close now, so we can wrap this up. It's been 90 minutes. This is actually pretty good for me. When I did this presentation in person, I feel like, I think it was like 2 hours, because I was just like living. I was on a roll. So this got like a little bit better, got a little bit tighter. Let's talk about some positive actions that we can take as anti-imperialists, as pan-Africanists, as revolutionary socialists to learn from and build upon the victory of the national liberation struggle in Zimbabwe. First and foremost, the most important thing you could do if you are not in an organization fighting for justice, comrade, what are you waiting for? We are descending into fascism, y'all. You think the Democrats are going to save us? All they can do is pose. All they can do is have rallies. There is no plan. It's just going to get worse. It's only going to stop if we take collective organized action to stop it. These people are not going to save us. We have to save ourselves. The way we save ourselves is by moving collectively in permanent political organizations to fight, to transform our conditions, just like the Africans in Zimbabwe did. So if you are not in an organization fighting for justice, get in an organization fighting for justice. Also, I'm holding this button because I just like to play with things. But let me show y'all, because it's an organization. I got this button at the U.S.-Cuba Normalization Conference, and it is for an organization called Radical Elders, which is a national formation of elders of the revolutionary movements. Like comrade that gave me this, but a revolutionary Puerto Rican elder. There are African elders in it. There are European elders in it. They're united nationally to build like a backbone for the movement of experience, of mentorship. So shout out to Radical Elders. If you're an elder and looking for an organization, join Radical Elders. If you're an African, join the All African People's Revolutionary Party. Join the Black Alliance for Peace. If you are European, The world is your oyster. There's DSA, there's the PSL, there's Workers' World Party, there's Frizzo. Just don't join a Zionist organization. And don't join an organization that is not trying to overthrow settler colonialism, because like I said, you cannot make revolution in the context of a settler state if you do not understand settler colonialism is the foundation of the class structure, is the foundation of everything. So find an organization fighting for justice that is fighting to overthrow imperialism and all its tentacles, all its tactics. And in that organization, you should be engaging in a process of collective political education to understand our enemy, to understand the strategy the enemy uses against us, and to understand how we can work together to defeat that enemy. So we got to study sanctions, because sanctions are one of the primary toolkits in the toolbox of this imperialist system, what they are primarily using to attack anti-imperialist movements, to attack revolutionary and socialist countries like Cuba, like Venezuela, like Nicaragua, like Zimbabwe. It is their go-to. So we must understand how they work. And we must also understand how these countries like Zimbabwe, like Cuba, like Venezuela, like the DPRK are resisting them. We also have to study settler colonialism. It's so wild. It's so wild how little the left in the US, which is like the most virulent and powerful settler state on the planet, how little the left in the US understands settler colonialism. Like, I have been fortunate to have been politicized and activated in areas like occupied Tiwa territory, like Klamath Land in Oregon, where there was like strong revolutionary indigenous organizations who would not allow people to hand wave away settler colonialism. And then I moved to this part of the country, and what I realized is that though there are strong revolutionary indigenous organizations, like the American Indian movement is here, there is not like a consciousness of the fact that indigenous people still exist and are still fighting for their land back, and like the basic history of settler colonialism in the United States. Like, people just act like it's a thing that happened and it's done now and we're in something else. And I'm like, oh no, like, no, that's not how it worked. And the reason for that is because like they're not teaching this in school. They're not teaching about the basics of settler colonialism as a process in capitalist educational institutions. And also left organizations are taking up an idealist understanding of the history of the United States as a settler project, and not reading about it from the perspective of African and indigenous peoples who are resisting it every step of the way. And so the consequence is that now we have the reactionary right-wing version of like settler identity and settler mythology. Then we also have like leftist versions of settler identity and settler mythology, which basically, again, act like settler colonialism was a thing that happened, that finished, that indigenous people are not a factor, they don't exist anymore, and that we can just be American on someone else's land, and that's somehow different from what the other settlers do. So it's a hot ass mess. We have to, like, there's so many things that become much easier to understand about why the U.S. is the way it is when you understand settler colonialism, like the reason why so many European settler men will flip out and kill like 15 to 25 people at like a Walmart or whatever. Like, why does that keep happening? If you understand settler colonialism, you understand the mass shooter part of aspect of U.S. culture, and you also understand the gun culture. If you understand settler colonialism, you understand why it is that all of these corporations, like Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, oh my God, what's the other one? Barclays, all of these corporations that still exist, that have like wealth going back hundreds of years, like how they came to be in the position they're in. If you understand settler colonialism, you understand why it is the same handful of families, Anglo families, that have been in political and economic power for a long, long time, since the inception of the country, and why that has changed very, very little in terms of who controls the wealth. All of those things will be a mystery to you unless you study how settler colonialism developed in the United States. And a really good book, actually, to read about how settler colonialism developed in the United States is An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. Once you understand settler colonialism, it unlocks so many wild-ass things about U.S. imperialist culture, U.S. settler culture. You should also study the national liberation struggles of African indigenous peoples all over the world. Like I said, the tactics that the British used to colonize and steal land in Zimbabwe. They used all over the world. Zimbabwe successfully defeated them, overthrew them, took their land back, and they managed to sustain themselves under constant attack. These are things that we can and should learn from, because some of these things we have to do too. So if they already won and they're continuing to win, let's study how they did that, so that when we face similar challenges, we have this model that we have learned from to understand what we have to do to win as well. And then also, like I mentioned, 1/3, oh my God. So Musa mentioning in the chat the outrageous rates of missing and murdered indigenous women by settler men. Yes, like the construction of masculinity, the construction of gender identity in the context of a settler state, and the kind of ritualized violence against women, particularly indigenous and African women, that produces is something that you only understand when you understand settler-colonialism. So many things about the culture of this society only make sense if you understand settler-colonialism. And so like I mentioned before, 1/3 of the Earth's human population is suffering under economic sanctions imposed by Western powers like the US, the United Nations, and the European Unions. We need a global movement of colonized, poor, and working class peoples organizing to oppose, to resist, to end economic sanctions. We need people in our neighborhoods, block by block, to understand that the very same people imposing sanctions on Zimbabwe for taking their land back, the very same people blockading Cuba for building a socialist revolution to define the US, are the same people cutting our Social Security, cutting our welfare, cutting our food stamps, cutting our unemployment. It's the same people carrying out economic sanctions internationally and economic sanctions domestically. Shout out to Erica Keynes, who has an excellent article about this on Hood Communists, making the connection between domestic austerity programs that drastically impact African indigenous people and colonized and poor working class people in the United States, and the very same people carrying out the domestic policies, carrying out international campaigns of economic sanctions, targeting our family. Same people inside, same people outside. Let's build a global movement to resist it. So that was it. I'm tired. We got through it in an hour and 40 minutes, maybe 50 minutes. 50 minutes. So if you enjoyed this presentation was developed by the Florida chapter of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. You should definitely follow us on Instagram if you have not already. We are APRP Florida on Facebook and Instagram. Also, let me put up the that overlay. Definitely follow Hood Communists. Like, if you have not subscribed to the channel and you sat through this whole thing, you might as well go ahead and subscribe, and then you'll get notified the next time we go live, next time we have a deep dive on some other topics. So please subscribe. Please also like and share this video and talk about it with your comments. And then definitely encourage you to follow. Can I point to it? Let's see. Follow the Hood Communist Instagram. We post excerpts from the articles that we publish on our blog. We also post to our stories different events that the organizations involved in Hood Communists are putting together. So definitely follow us on Instagram, like us on YouTube, subscribe to our YouTube. And I think that's it. So thank y'all so much for tuning in. Thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. Thank you for liking the video. Thank you for sharing. I cannot say I'm going to do this again, but we have the goal to build out this channel. So please make sure that you subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. Have a good rest of your night. And now I'm going to put up a flyer for a donation campaign that we are running for the Mayday Brigade, which is departing the U.S. for Cuba, April 26th. We are trying to raise funds for our legal and licensed travel. And so if you just got paid, you're feeling generous, you want to make a contribution to internationalist organizing, to international solidarity work, you can get the info to donate to the Mayday Brigade on the flyer I'm going to put up. And you have a great rest of your night.
anybody.